The towel slipped from my fingers, a cascade of white cotton tumbling to the polished hardwood floor like a sigh released into the stillness. "Elena," he whispered, his voice a soft quake, trembling with a reverence that seemed to carve the air between us. His eyes, deep pools of shadowed green, locked onto me, drinking me in as though I were a fleeting vision, a mirage he feared might vanish if he blinked. His hands, hesitant yet driven by some unspoken hunger, reached out, fingertips grazing the arc of my shoulders, tracing the swell of my hips with a touch so tender it felt like he was etching me into memory, stroke by reverent stroke. This was the moment, the fragile spark that set everything ablaze. Before I pull you deeper into this tale, let me pause to extend a hand. If these words stir something in your soul, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel and give this story a like. Each tap of your finger is a whisper of encouragement, a nudge that keeps us spinning these threads of meaning for you. Drop your thoughts below, your questions, your dreams, because every word you share weaves us closer, binding us into a community that breathes together through stories like this. Stick with us until the end. I promise it's a journey worth taking. My name is Elena, and at 65, I wear my years like a tapestry, woven with threads of grace and resilience. My figure still curves in ways that turn heads, soft and full, a silhouette that defies the passage of time. My skin, smooth as river-worn stone, glows with a quiet warmth, and my smile, wide, unguarded, blooms like a flower caught in the first light of dawn, captivating even to me when I catch it in the mirror. My hair, a cascade of silver, falls in loose waves past my shoulders, shimmering like moonlight spilled across a dark sea, while my eyes, hazel shot through with flecks of gold, hold a depth that seems to beckon, a secret allure I've never fully understood. I live alone now, in a house that's become my sanctuary since my husband slipped away into the ether years ago. Romance, with all its tangled promises, has been a door I've kept bolted shut, the key buried beneath layers of dust and memory. Men have tried, gentlemen with graying temples seeking a companion to share their twilight, younger souls bold enough to chase a flame they see flickering in me, but I've turned them all away. I'm too old for love's wild dance, I tell myself, a mantra I repeat in the quiet hours, though deep down I know it's a lie. The truth is a shadow I rarely face. I've locked my heart in a cage, terrified of the ache that comes with letting it fly free. My home sits perched on the edge of a sleepy town, a haven of weathered wood and soft whites, where sunlight spills through lace curtains to paint golden patterns on the walls. The living room hums with the gentle creak of an old rocking chair, its cushions worn soft by years of stillness, while the kitchen carries the faint perfume of cinnamon and sage from the loaves I baked to fill the silence. Out back, a garden unfurls in a riot of color. Roses blushing red, lavender swaying in the breeze, their scents weaving through the air like a lover's whisper. It's a place of peace, predictable as the slow tick of the mantel clock, a rhythm I've grown accustomed to, until that evening when the phone's sharp trills sliced through the calm like a blade. It was James, my nephew, the only child of my elder sister, Clara. At 34, he's a storm wrapped in charm, tall and broad-shouldered, with an athletic frame that moves with a predator's grace. His grin, sharp and mischievous, promises trouble in the best way, and his eyes, green as a forest after rain, sparkle with a restless energy that pulls people in, whether they mean to be drawn or not. Clara's voice has often crackled through the line, laced with exasperation. "Elena, that boy's going to drive me to an early grave. Always chasing skirts, never settling down." I'd chuckle, brushing it off as the folly of youth, telling her he'd grow out of it. But James isn't like other men his age. There's a current beneath his easy swagger, a magnetism that hooks deep and doesn't let go, even when you see the danger glinting in its depths. "Hey, Aunt Elena," his voice spilled through the receiver, bright as sunlight but edged with a shadow I couldn't place. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything. I was wondering, could I come stay with you for the weekend? I just need a break." The request landed like a pebble in still water, sending ripples through my chest. James wasn't the type to seek refuge in my quiet world. His life thrummed with the pulse of the city, late nights, laughter, the clink of glasses in crowded bars, a far cry from the slow sway of my porch swing and the chirp of crickets at dusk. Yet there was something in his tone, a hitch beneath the cheer that snagged my attention. I paused, the silence stretching taut, my fingers tightening around the phone. A break from what? I wanted to ask, but the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Instead, I softened, a wave of affection washing over me. "Of course, James," I said, my voice warm as the tea cooling in my cup. "You're always welcome here. This place is yours too. You know that." His reply came quick, a quiet "Thanks, Aunt Elena," tinged with relief, and then the line clicked dead. I set the phone down, staring at its sleek black shell as curiosity bloomed in my chest, sharp and insistent. What was he running from? A woman who'd tangled his heart? A fight with Clara's sharp tongue? James was a riddle, his layers tucked beneath that dazzling smile, and I couldn't shake the sense that this weekend would peel back something I wasn't ready to see. Friday evening crept in like a thief, the sky igniting in a blaze of amber and rose as the sun sank behind the trees. I sat in the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa, a steaming mug of chamomile cradled in my hands. The room glowed soft and golden, the light catching the edges of the faded floral throw draped over the armrest, the bookshelf sagging under the weight of novels and trinkets I'd collected over decades. Outside, the garden rustled, leaves whispering secrets to the wind, and I felt a flutter of nerves I couldn't name, a bird trapped beneath my ribs. Then came the low growl of his car, tires crunching gravel as he pulled into the drive, and I rose, smoothing my skirt, the fabric cool against my palms. The door swung open, and there he was, James, framed in the dying light, a silhouette of effortless grace. His dark jeans hugged his lean legs, a black shirt stretched tight across his chest, outlining the hard planes of muscle beneath. His hair, dark and slightly tousled, caught the last rays of sun, and his smile, bright, warm, familiar, lit the room like a lantern. But his eyes, they carried something else, a flicker of unrest, a storm brewing behind the calm that made my breath catch. "Aunt Elena," he called, his voice a burst of affection as he crossed the threshold, pulling me into a hug that enveloped me in warmth and strength. His arms were solid, grounding, and for a moment, I let myself sink into it, the scent of cedar and faint musk clinging to him. "You look amazing as always," he said, stepping back, his grin teasing but his gaze lingering a beat too long. I laughed, the sound lightening the air, though my cheeks warmed under his scrutiny. "And you're as charming as ever," I shot back, waving him inside. "Come on, let's get you settled." He followed, his boots scuffing softly against the floor, his eyes sweeping the space, the overstuffed sofa, the cracked leather armchair, the faint aroma of cinnamon still drifting from the kitchen. It was a house that breathed comfort, a stark contrast to the whirlwind I imagined he'd left behind, and I wondered if he felt it too, the pull of its quiet embrace. He dropped onto the couch with a sigh, the cushions sinking beneath him as if he'd shed a weight he'd carried too long. "God, I've missed this place," he said, tipping his head back, eyes drifting shut for a heartbeat. I settled into the armchair across from him, the fabric cool against my legs, and arched a brow, curiosity prickling like static. "Has it really been that long?" I asked, my tone light but probing. He cracked one eye open, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Feels like it," he replied, his voice dipping low. "Life's been a lot lately. Non-stop." The words hung there, heavy with something he didn't name, and I leaned forward, waiting for more. But he just shook his head, that grin sliding back into place like armor, deflecting my silent questions. The evening unfolded in gentle waves. Dinner at the old oak table, the clink of forks against plates, the hum of crickets seeping through the open window. Later we drifted to the garden, the air thick with the sweet tang of jasmine, the sky a velvet expanse pricked with stars. We sat on the wrought iron bench, its cool metal pressing into my thighs, and I watched him, his profile sharp against the dusk, his shoulders tense despite the relaxed sprawl of his legs. The silence wrapped around us, comfortable yet alive with an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost reluctant, cutting through the night like a blade through silk. "You ever feel like you're stuck, Aunt Elena? Like you're spinning in this endless loop? Parties, people, all of it, and it just drains you dry?" The question landed hard, peeling back the mask of the James the first thought I knew, the carefree charmer, the golden boy who danced through life without a care. I shifted closer, the bench creaking beneath me, and met his gaze. His eyes were dark, searching, and for a moment, the world shrank to the space between us, the air crackling with something unspoken. "Sometimes," I said softly, my voice a thread of truth, "but you're young, James. You've got time to break free, to carve your own path." He turned to me fully, his stare piercing, intense, and my breath caught, a shiver racing down my spine. Maybe, he murmured, but there was a weight to it, a question lurking in the shadows of his words. His hand twitched as if he might reach for me, but he held back, the tension coiling tighter. The night deepened, the stars winking overhead. And as we sat there I felt it, the first thread of something unraveling. A pull I couldn't name but couldn't escape. It was a thread tied to him, to us, and I wasn't sure I could tug it loose without unraveling everything I'd built to keep myself safe. Equals. The garden shimmered under a silver moon, its light spilling across the lawn in delicate ribbons, casting long trembling shadows that danced with the breeze. James's words from earlier lingered like smoke, curling through my thoughts. His quiet confession of feeling trapped, a crack in the armor of the man I'd always seen as untouchable. I sat on the wrought iron bench, its chill seeping through my skirt, and stole a glance at him. His silhouette was sharp against the night, jaw tight, eyes fixed on some distant point as if chasing a truth he couldn't grasp. The air between us hummed, thick with something unspoken, a ember glowing beneath the surface that I couldn't yet name, or wouldn't. The weekend unfolded like a flower opening to dawn, slow and deliberate, each petal revealing a new layer of him, of us. James shed his city-born restlessness bit by bit, his presence breathing life into the quiet hollows of my home. The living room, with its threadbare rug and amber lamps, seemed to pulse in his orbit, the walls soaking up the sound of his laughter like parched earth drinks rain. Over breakfast he'd tease me, snatching a strip of bacon from my plate with a grin that lit his face like wildfire, his knuckles brushing mine in a way that felt too intentional to dismiss. "Thief?" I'd mutter, swatting his hand, but my voice betrayed me, softening into a laugh as his touch lingered, a phantom warmth that clung to my skin long after he pulled away. One afternoon, the sun hung heavy in a cloudless sky, its rays piercing the kitchen window to pool on the worn tiles in golden patches. We stood side by side, chopping vegetables for a stew, the air rich with the bite of onions and the earthiness of thyme. The clack of our knives fell into a rhythm, a quiet harmony that felt strangely intimate, as if we'd done this 100 times before. James shifted closer, too close, his shoulder grazing mine as he reached for a pepper, the heat of him radiating through the thin fabric of my blouse. "You're spoiling me, Aunt Elena," he said, popping a slice into his mouth, his voice a low hum that vibrated through the space between us. His eyes caught the light, glinting like polished stone, and a flush crept up my neck, unbidden and fierce. "Spoiling you?" I shot back, half teasing, my knife pausing mid-slice. "You're the one eating half the ingredients before they hit the pot." He chuckled, a sound that rolled through me like a wave, and leaned in, his breath warm against my ear as he murmured, "You deserve it. You know, someone looking after you for a change." The words sank deep, heavy with a tenderness that stirred something long dormant, a yearning I'd buried beneath years of solitude. His hand brushed my arm, adjusting the cutting board, and the air thickened, a spark igniting where his fingers lingered, leaving me dizzy in its wake. That evening, the house settled into a hush, the only sounds the faint creak of settling wood and the distant chirp of crickets beyond the walls. I was curled on the sofa, a novel splayed across my lap, its pages blurring as my mind drifted, to him, to the way his presence seemed to shift the gravity of every room. James appeared without warning, a shadow in the doorway that solidified as he dropped beside me, the cushions dipping under his weight. His arm slid across my shoulders, casual yet deliberate, and I froze, the heat of him seeping through my sweater like a brand. "Caught you reading something mushy, huh?" he teased, leaning in to peek at the book, his voice a velvet taunt, his breath grazing my cheek. "None of your business," I snapped, slamming the cover shut, my face burning as I felt his gaze, playful, piercing, pin me in place. His laugh was rich, deep, a rumble that sent a shiver racing down my spine, and his fingers brushed my arm, a fleeting touch that sparked like flint on steel. I bolted upright, fussing with the curtains across the room, their lace cool against my trembling hands. "You're too restless," I muttered, forcing irritation into my tone, but my pulse thundered, a wild drumbeat I couldn't silence. "You love it," he replied, his voice dripping with mischief, that grin of his sharp, knowing, tugging at something primal inside me. I turned away, pretending to adjust the fabric, but his eyes followed, heavy and unyielding, stoking a flame I wasn't ready to face. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, and I fled to the kitchen, seeking refuge in the mundane. Stacking dishes, wiping counters, anything to quiet the storm he'd unleashed. Later, the kitchen was a sanctuary of shadows, the single bulb overhead casting a soft halo across the countertops, glinting off the stainless steel sink. I stood there, rinsing plates, the clink of porcelain a soothing cadence against the chaos in my chest. Footsteps sounded behind me, soft but deliberate, and I turned, my breath catching in my throat. James stood in the doorway, bare-chested, the dim light sculpting his form, broad shoulders, the hard planes of his stomach, shadows pooling in the dips of his collarbone. His hair was tousled, dark strands falling into his eyes, and those eyes, dark, searching, locked onto mine with an intensity that pinned me where I stood. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his voice a low rumble, stepping closer until the space between us shrank to a whisper. His bare skin gleamed faintly, a sheen of warmth in the cool night, and I swallowed hard, my gaze darting away, then back, drawn like a moth to flame. "Me neither," I whispered, my voice fragile, betraying the tremor beneath. He tilted his head, studying me, and the air grew thick, a taut cord ready to snap. "You've been quiet today," he observed, concern threading through his words, his brows knitting slightly. "You okay?" I nodded, but the lie trembled on my lips, my chest tightening under the weight of his attention. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, until he broke it, his voice dropping to a whisper that hung in the air like mist. "You're the most stunning woman I've ever known, Elena." The words struck like a match, igniting a rush of heat that stole my breath, flooding my veins with a fire I couldn't quench. "James, don't," I pleaded, my voice barely audible, a thread about to break, but he stepped closer, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was electric, a jolt that raced through me, rooting me to the spot. "Why not?" he pressed, his eyes locking with mine, vulnerable yet fierce, a storm I couldn't escape. "It's true. James, this isn't." I started, my words faltering as his hand slid to my waist, pulling me against him. The world tilted, his warmth enveloping me, his chest solid and steady against mine. His lips brushed my cheek, so close to my mouth I could feel the heat of his breath, a promise hovering in the space between us. My breath hitched, my body leaning into his despite the scream of reason in my mind, the strength of his arms a tether I couldn't break. "We can't," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, drowned by the roar of my pulse, the pull of him overwhelming every defense I'd built. His lips lingered, a heartbeat from mine, his hands tightening on my waist as if anchoring me to him. The air crackled, charged with a longing that pulsed between us, and for a moment I was lost, teetering on the edge of surrender. But then I pulled back, trembling, the cold air rushing in where his touch had been, a shock to my senses. "Good night, James," I managed, my voice barely audible, quaking with the emotions I couldn't name. I turned and fled to my room, his gaze burning into my back, heavy and unyielding, a weight I carried up the stairs. That night, sleep was a stranger, my mind a tempest of him. His words soft as a caress, his touch firm yet tender, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only light in his shadowed world. I tossed beneath the sheets, the cotton cool against my fevered skin, replaying that moment in the kitchen, the press of his body, the whisper of his breath, the fire in his eyes. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting madness born of loneliness, a spark that would fade with the dawn. But deep down, a truth unfurled, sharp and undeniable. I craved him, his nearness, his voice, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. It was a craving that clawed at me, fierce and relentless, and as I lay there, staring at the ceiling's faint cracks, I knew it terrified me. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt so right. The house creaked around me, a sentinel in the night, and outside, the wind sighed through the garden, carrying the scent of jasmine through the cracked window. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the wild thump of my heart, and wondered how long I could fight this, how long I could deny the flame he'd lit inside me, a flame that flickered brighter with every stolen glance, every brush of his skin against mine. Morning would come, and with it the pretense of normalcy, but beneath it all something had shifted. A thread pulled loose, a fire stirring, and I wasn't sure I could snuff it out, even if I wanted to. Equals. Morning broke over the house like a fragile promise, sunlight slicing through the blinds to spill across the bedroom floor in jagged shards. I woke tangled in sheets, the echoes of a restless night clinging to me. James's voice, a velvet murmur in the dark, his hands steady and warm, his gaze a tether that pulled me under. I rose, my limbs heavy with the weight of dreams I couldn't shake, and descended the stairs, the wooden steps groaning beneath my feet. In the kitchen, James was already there, leaning against the counter, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand. He flashed that easy smile, bright as the dawn, as if the charged silence of last night had never happened. "Morning, Aunt Elena," he said, his tone light, teasing. "Sleep well?" "Barely," I replied, forcing a laugh, but when our eyes met, a spark flared. A silent pact, a shared secret shimmering beneath the surface. He handed me a mug, his fingers grazing mine, and the brief contact sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric, rekindling the ember that had smoldered through the night. I turned away, busying myself with the kettle, but I felt his gaze linger, a weight that pressed against my spine, stirring the air with a heat I couldn't ignore. The days that followed blurred into a delicate dance, a push and pull of tension and tenderness that wound tighter with every hour. James lingered closer now, his presence a constant hum in my orbit, his hand resting on my shoulder as he passed, a casual brush of fingers when he handed me a plate. Each touch was a match struck against my resolve, a flame licking at the edges of the walls I'd built around myself. I felt myself softening, yielding, drawn to him like a river to the sea, unable to resist the current pulling me under. One morning as we sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of dew-soaked grass, he reached for my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles. "You've got magic in these hands, Elena," he murmured, his voice a low hum, and my breath caught, my skin tingling where he touched me, a shiver racing up my arm. By afternoon the heat pressed down like a heavy hand, the sun blazing through a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. Sweat beaded on my neck, the humidity wrapping me in a stifling embrace, and I decided a shower would be my salvation. I slipped into my bedroom, the space a cocoon of calm, white walls bathed in soft light, the bed draped in a quilt of faded blues, a breeze slipping through the cracked window to stir the curtains. I shed my clothes, letting them pool on the floor in a careless heap, and wrapped myself in a thin towel, its cotton cool against my flushed skin. My hair, damp with perspiration, clung to my neck in silver tendrils, and I caught my reflection in the mirror, eyes wide, cheeks pink, a woman caught between restraint and recklessness. I was reaching for the bathroom door when it hit me. My phone left buzzing on the living room coffee table, its insistent trill a faint echo through the house. I hesitated, the sound nagging but not urgent. Nothing that couldn't wait a few minutes. But then came a knock, soft yet firm, a rap that stilled my hand on the knob. "Aunt Elena?" James's voice filtered through the wood, low and tentative, and before I could answer, the door creaked open. He stood there, framed in the doorway, my phone dangling from his hand, his words faltering as his eyes found me. "Your phone's been..." The sentence died on his lips, his breath catching as his gaze swept over me. The towel hugged my damp skin, clinging to the curve of my waist, steam curling from the bathroom to halo me in a faint mist. My shoulders glistened, bare and vulnerable, and his eyes widened, a sharp inhale breaking the silence. Time slowed, the room shrinking until it held only us, the air thick with a charge that crackled like static. "James," I whispered, my voice a fragile thread, my throat tightening as I clutched the towel tighter, my heart a wild drumbeat echoing in my chest. He moved before I could think, 2 swift strides closing the distance, his boots silent on the hardwood. His hands, strong, steady, cupped my face, his thumbs tracing the line of my cheekbones with a gentleness that belied the hunger in his eyes. They searched mine, flickering with hesitation, with need, with a fire that mirrored the one roaring inside me. "Elena," he breathed, his voice raw, desperate. "I can't hold back anymore." And then he kissed me. A storm breaking, a fierce collision of lips that stole the air from my lungs. His mouth was soft but insistent, tasting of coffee and longing, a current that surged through me, stunning me into stillness. For a heartbeat I was frozen, my mind reeling, caught in the shock of it, his warmth, his urgency, the press of him against me. Then something snapped, a dam bursting within, and I kissed him back, my arms sliding around his neck, fingers tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. The towel slipped, caught between us, and his hands shifted, one steadying my waist, the other sliding to my back, his touch firm yet tender, anchoring me as our bodies pressed together. "I've wanted this for so long," he murmured against my lips, his voice rough with need. The words a match tossed into dry grass, igniting a blaze I couldn't contain. The towel gave way entirely, slipping to the floor in a soft crumple, and he pulled back just enough to look at me, his breath ragged, his eyes tracing every inch of me with a reverence that made my skin hum. "Elena," he whispered, awe threading through his voice, and his fingers followed his gaze, skimming my shoulders, dipping along the curve of my spine, brushing the swell of my hips as if I were a treasure he'd unearthed after years of searching. I shivered, caught in the tide of him, my hands clutching his shirt, the fabric taut under my grip. Reason screamed in the distance, "This is wrong, this is forbidden," but it drowned beneath the roar of desire, the overwhelming pull of his touch. His lips found my neck, a soft graze that sent heat spiraling through me, and I arched into him, a gasp escaping as his mouth lingered, warm and deliberate. My hand slid beneath his shirt, tracing the hard lines of his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath my palms, a rhythm that matched the wild beat of my own. The room spun, sunlight blurring into a golden haze, and for a moment nothing existed beyond us. The press of his body, the heat of his breath, the way he held me like I was the only thing keeping him afloat. His hands roamed, one cupping my face, the other pulling me tighter, and he kissed me again, deeper, hungrier, his tongue brushing mine in a dance that left me trembling. "James," I gasped, breaking away just enough to speak, but he silenced me with another kiss, fierce and unyielding, his grip tightening as if he feared I'd slip away. The towel lay forgotten, the air cool against my bare skin, but his warmth enveloped me, a fire that consumed every doubt. "You're everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his forehead resting against mine, and I felt it, the breaking wave of us crashing over me, pulling me under until I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. But then a whisper clawed through the haze, "This can't happen, not like this," and I pulled back, trembling, my chest heaving with uneven breaths. "James, we can't," I said, my voice quaking, but he held me, his eyes dark and unwavering, a storm I couldn't outrun. "Why not?" he asked, his tone low, steady, a challenge wrapped in vulnerability. His hands stayed on me, one at my waist, the other brushing my cheek, and I couldn't move, couldn't think, caught in the gravity of him. "Tell me why, Elena," he pressed, his voice a lifeline, and I opened my mouth to answer, to push him away, but no words came. Instead he leaned in, his lips hovering over mine, and I felt the pull again, stronger, fiercer, a tide I couldn't resist. The room held its breath, the sunlight fading as clouds rolled in, casting us in shadow. I stood there, bare and exposed, his hands still on me, his gaze a mirror to the chaos inside. "James," I whispered, but it wasn't a protest, it was a surrender, a plea, and he heard it. He kissed me again, softer this time, a promise sealed in the quiet, and I let myself fall, swept away by the breaking wave of us, knowing there was no turning back. Equals. The afternoon melted into dusk, the sky bleeding crimson and gold beyond the garden's tangled edge, a canvas of fire that mirrored the tumult within me. I sat on the stone bench, its surface rough and cool beneath my hands, the evening breeze weaving through my hair, carrying the sweet musk of roses and the sharp tang of freshly turned earth. My mind churned, a restless sea replaying that moment in the bedroom, the towel's soft surrender to the floor, the heat of James's hands mapping my skin, the way his kiss had unraveled me thread by thread. It was a line crossed, a wall crumbled, and the weight of it pressed against my ribs, guilt and yearning twisting together, a knot I couldn't untie. The air shifted, a subtle ripple, and I sensed him before I saw him, James, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path, a shadow emerging from the twilight. He settled beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a quiet storm that stirred the stillness. His presence was a balm and a burn, soothing my frayed edges while igniting the ember that refused to die. "Aunt Elena," he began, his voice low but steady, carrying a fragility that made my chest ache. "I know this is messy, complicated, but I don't regret what happened today. And more than anything, I don't want it to end here, not like this." I turned to him, my heart a tangled snarl of thorns, his words slicing through the haze. His eyes dark, resolute, locked onto mine, a flicker of hope dancing in their depths, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. "James," I said, the name slipping out sharp and unsteady. "This isn't just messy, it's wrong." The confession spilled free, raw and jagged, a truth I'd been wrestling with since his lips first found mine. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. his gaze holding mine with a quiet fire that dared me to explain. Why? He pressed, leaning closer, his voice a blade cutting through my defenses. Is it what people might say? The years between us? Tell me, Elena. His breath brushed my cheek, warm and insistent, and I shook my head, my hands clenching in my lap, nails biting into my palms. No, I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible over the rustle of leaves. It's not that. It's how I feel about you. That's what terrifies me. The words hung there, naked and vulnerable, a confession that stripped me bare. His expression softened, the hard edges melting into something tender, and for a moment, the world held its breath, suspended in the space between us. He reached for my hand, his fingers threading through mine, warm and firm, a lifeline in the storm. Then let it terrify you, he said, his tone gentle but unyielding, a vow wrapped in velvet. But don't run from it, not from me. His thumb brushed my knuckles, a slow, deliberate stroke that sent a shiver racing up my arm, and I felt the ember flare, glowing brighter, threatening to consume me whole. I wanted to pull away, to rebuild the walls he'd torn down, but his touch anchored me, and I couldn't move, couldn't deny the pull that tethered me to him. That night, the tension snapped like a thread stretched too thin. I was in the living room, the television's murmur a distant hum, its flickering light painting the walls in restless blues. I sat on the sofa, legs tucked beneath me, a throw blanket draped over my lap, but my mind was elsewhere. Lost in the memory of his hands, his lips, the way he'd held me like I was something sacred. James appeared without a sound, a shadow that solidified as he sank beside me, the cushions dipping under his weight. His closeness was a sudden blaze, the heat of him seeping through the thin fabric of my dress, and I froze, my breath catching as he turned to me. I can't keep pretending, he said, his voice low, urgent, cutting through the quiet like a blade. I don't want to act like nothing's changed when all I can think about is you. His words hung heavy, a challenge and a plea, and before I could respond he moved, his hand cupping my face, his thumb grazing my cheek as he pulled me to him. His lips claimed mine in a kiss that started soft, tentative, then deepened into something hungry, a fire fed by days of restraint. My hands found his chest, fingers splaying over the steady thump of his heart, and I melted into him, the world fading to ash around us. His fingers traced my spine, igniting shivers that danced across my skin, and I pressed closer, the blanket slipping to the floor as our bodies aligned. His mouth moved against mine, warm and sure, a rhythm that pulsed with need, and when we broke apart breathless, his eyes held mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. Elena, he whispered, his voice rough, his forehead resting against mine. You're all I want. The confession was a spark, and I answered it with another kiss, fiercer this time, my hands sliding beneath his shirt to feel the heat of his skin, the hard lines of muscle beneath my touch. From that moment we stole pieces of time, carving out a secret world within the walls of my home. In the kitchen, as steam rose from simmering pots, he'd catch me from behind, his arms wrapping around my waist, his lips brushing the nape of my neck in a kiss that sent heat pooling low in my belly. I'd laugh, swatting him away, but my protests were weak, dissolving into a sigh as his hands lingered, tracing the curve of my hips with a reverence that made my knees tremble. In the garden, beneath a canopy of stars, we'd sit on the grass, his fingers weaving through mine, his thumb stroking my palm as he murmured stories of his life, wild nights, fleeting loves, his voice a soft hymn that wove us closer. Each touch, each glance built the ember into a flame, a glow I couldn't extinguish. One evening, the air thick with the scent of rain, we stood on the porch, the world beyond shrouded in mist. He pulled me against him, his hands framing my face, and kissed me slow and deep, the kind of kiss that felt like a promise etched into my bones. I've never felt this before, he murmured, his lips brushing mine as he spoke, his breath warm against my skin. Not with anyone, not like this. My hand slid up his arms, feeling the strength beneath his shirt, and I pressed myself closer, the rain's soft patter a curtain around us, sealing us in our own universe. His fingers slipped beneath my blouse, grazing my sides, and I shivered, arching into him as his touch ignited a fire that spread through me, relentless and wild. But as the night deepened, a shadow crept in, a whisper of doubt, a cold thread winding through the warmth. I pulled back, my chest heaving, and his eyes searched mine, concern flickering in their depths. What's wrong? he asked, his voice soft, his hand still resting on my waist, grounding me. I don't know, I admitted, my voice quaking, vulnerable in its honesty. It's so much, James. Too much. He nodded, understanding, softening his features, and he pulled me into his arms, his embrace a shelter against the storm inside me. It's okay, he whispered, his lips brushing my temple, a gentle reassurance. We'll figure it out together. His words were a lifeline, and I clung to them, to him, as the ember glowed steady and sure, a light in the dark I couldn't turn away from. The days that followed were a tapestry of stolen moments, his hand finding mine as we walked the garden paths, his laughter spilling into the quiet as we cooked side by side, his body pressed against mine in the stillness of night. Each touch was bolder now, more confident, his fingers tracing the curve of my jaw, his lips grazing my collarbone, sending shivers racing through me. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the living room window, he pulled me onto the sofa, his arms wrapping around me as he kissed me slow and deep, his hands roaming my back, igniting a heat that left me breathless. You're everything to me, he murmured, his voice a low growl against my ear, and I felt it, the embers glow steady and fierce, a fire I no longer wanted to fight. But beneath it all, the questions lingered. What did this mean for us? Could we keep this flame alive in a world that wouldn't understand? I pushed them aside, losing myself in him, in the way he made me feel. Alive, desired, whole. The ember had become a blaze, and as I lay in his arms that night, the house silent around us, I knew I was caught in its glow, unable to turn back, unwilling to let it fade. The days wove themselves into a delicate rhythm. A quiet symphony of stolen glances and whispered promises that filled the spaces of my home with a warmth I hadn't known I'd been missing. Our love grew in the shadows, a secret flame we tended with care, its glow a beacon in the stillness. James became my constant, his presence a steady hum that threaded through every room, every moment. The living room, with its sagging sofa and flickering lamps, became a haven where his laughter danced against the walls, the kitchen a sanctuary where his hands brushed mine over steaming pots, igniting sparks that lingered long after the meal was done. Outside, the garden bloomed wild and free, its roses and lavender bowing to the breeze, a mirror to the untamed thing blossoming between us. He found ways to weave himself into my days, small gestures that spoke louder than words. Mornings greeted me with wildflowers, daisies and marigolds plucked from the garden's edge, left on the kitchen table, their petals bright against the worn wood, a silent gift that made my heart stutter. Notes appeared in unexpected places, tucked into the pages of my novels or slipped beneath a teacup, his handwriting a scrawl of affection. You're my light, Elena, or thinking of you always. Each one was a thread, stitching us closer, and I traced the ink with my fingers, feeling the weight of his care settle deep in my chest. In the quiet hours, his hand would find mine, fingers interlacing with a certainty that felt like home. His thumb stroking my skin in slow, soothing arcs that sent shivers racing up my spine. One evening, the sky unfurled above us, a vast expanse studded with stars that glittered like diamonds spilled across velvet. We sat on the porch steps, the wood cool beneath us, the air thick with the promise of rain and the faint perfume of damp earth. James turned to me, his face half-shadowed in the twilight, his eyes catching the starlight, fierce and unguarded. I want you to know something, he said, his voice steady, raw with an emotion that made my breath catch. I'm not going anywhere, Elena. Whatever happens, whatever storms come our way, I'm here. I'm with you. His words were a vow carved into the night, and tears prickled my eyes, hot and sudden, spilling over as I reached for his hand, gripping it tight. James, I whispered, my voice thick, trembling with the depth of what I felt. You've brought me back, lit up corners of me I thought were gone forever. I don't know what I'd do without you. He smiled, soft and radiant, and pulled me into his arms, his embrace a fortress against the world. His lips brushed my forehead, a tender seal to his promise, and I sank into him, the steady thud of his heart against my cheek a rhythm I could live by. In that moment, wrapped in the heat of him, I knew this was a love worth every risk, every whispered doubt. Our days became a tapestry of closeness, moments stolen in the quiet where time seemed to bend around us. In the kitchen, as sunlight streamed through the window, he'd catch me mid-stir, his arms circling my waist, his lips grazing the curve of my neck in a kiss that sent heat pooling low and fierce. I'd laugh, half protesting, but the sound dissolved into a sigh as his hand slid beneath my blouse, tracing the arc of my ribs with a reverence that made my knees buckle. "Your trouble," I'd murmur, turning in his arms, and he'd grin wicked and warm, before kissing me deep and slow, the taste of him salt and cedar, flooding my senses until the world blurred away. In the garden beneath the sprawling oak, we'd lie on a blanket, the grass cool beneath us, his head resting on my lap as I ran my fingers through his hair, dark strands slipping like silk between my touch. He'd catch my wrist, pressing a kiss to the pulse there, his lips lingering until my breath hitched, and then he'd pull me down, rolling us until I was beneath him, his body a shield against the sky. His hands roamed over my shoulders, down my sides, igniting trails of fire, and he'd kiss me again, fierce and hungry, a claim that left me trembling, lost in the uncharted flame of us. "You're mine, Elena," he'd whisper, his voice a growl against my ear, and I'd arch into him, answering with a kiss that matched his fire, our bodies tangled in a dance as old as time. Nights were our refuge, the house a cocoon of shadows and soft light where we shed the world's weight. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, we lay on the sofa, the fire crackling in the hearth, its glow painting us in hues of amber and gold. He pulled me close, my back against his chest, his arms wrapping around me as his lips found the sensitive spot beneath my ear. "I could stay like this forever," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin, and his hands slipped beneath my sweater, palms flat against my stomach, sending a shiver racing through me. I turned in his arms, meeting his gaze, dark, intense, alive with a love that mirrored my own, and kissed him slow and deep, my fingers threading through his hair as his hands roamed higher, igniting a heat that consumed us both. But even in the blaze, shadows lingered. Questions I couldn't silence. What did this mean for us beyond these walls? Could we hold this flame against a world that might never understand? I pushed them aside, losing myself in him, in the way he made me feel, desired, cherished, alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. One night, as we lay tangled in my bed, the sheets cool against our fevered skin, he traced the curve of my cheek, his touch tender, his eyes searching mine. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft, vulnerable, and I smiled, pressing my hand over his, feeling the steady beat of his pulse beneath my fingers. "More than I've been in years," I whispered, and he kissed me, a gentle collision that sealed us together, a promise that needed no words. Our love was a secret we guarded, a bond that deepened with every touch, every shared breath, a flame that burned bright and fierce, uniquely ours. As the weeks unfolded, I felt myself bloom anew, the years falling away under his gaze, his touch, his unwavering presence. He'd tease me in the mornings, stealing kisses over coffee, his hands lingering on my hips as he pulled me against him, his laughter a melody that filled the quiet. In the afternoons, we'd walk the garden paths, his arm around my shoulders, his lips brushing my temple as we watched the sun sink low, painting the world in shades of fire. At night he'd hold me close, his body a shield, his whispers a lullaby. "You're my everything, Elena." And I'd drift to sleep, wrapped in the certainty of us, a love that defied the odds, that defied the world. And so our story ends here, not with a fade to black, but with a flame that burns on, uncharted and unshakable. If you've stayed with us through this journey, thank you. From the depths of my heart, thank you. Before we part, let me invite you one last time. If you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. It's your support that keeps these tales alive, that fuels the fire we share. Give this story a like if it moved you, share it with someone who needs a spark, and drop your thoughts below. Every word you leave is a thread in the tapestry we're weaving together. Stay with us because there's more to come. More stories, more flames, more moments that matter. Until next time, take care, and may your own light burn bright. This journey of Elena and James has been a whirlwind of emotions, a tale that's tugged at my heartstrings and left me reflecting on the complexities of love, identity, and the courage it takes to embrace what truly matters. It's more than just a story. It's a lens into the human experience, crafted with an educational purpose, to explore the depths of connection and the lessons we learn when we dare to step beyond the expected. What did it stir in you? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how this resonated with you, what it made you feel, or even what you'd do in their shoes. Your comments keep this conversation alive, and every perspective you share helps us grow as a community. Let's dive deeper together.